All right, hello everyone. This is CounterYolo again, back after a couple months to give you another video about Star Trek Online. And in today's video, we're going to go over the Genesis bundle, which is a new bundle which includes a new Tier 6 Oberth, among other things. So we'll go ahead and get into that in just a moment. This bundle does include 2 starships, and they're 2 starships with fleet variants, which does mean that for those of you that are complete free-to-play players, these are starships that actually are going to matter for you because they are available from Tier 2 Fleet Military, which means if you're from any sort of active fleet whatsoever, they're pretty much going to have at least Tier 2 Fleet Military. So from an accessibility standpoint, these are starships that you can easily acquire inside the game. I will go over the 2 starships, their new traits and consoles, and none of the stuff of the traits and consoles are bad by any means. 2 of them should be decent, and 2 of the things in there are potentially game breaking. So we will talk about that later on inside the video. I'll also briefly talk about this, the other stuff in the Genesis bundle besides the 2 tokens and experimental upgrades, because I don't think that's really noteworthy to mention. They will be listed in the TLDW at the end of the video, so you can check that if you don't want to watch the video itself. Feel free to see the time links in the description or at the bottom bar at the bottom of the video as well. Those things will be in there like normal. And with that said, let's get on with the video. First off, when we do starship comparisons, I'm going to start with the Oberth because I'm more excited about that ship because we've been waiting a very long time to get a Tier 6 Oberth. Especially because there wasn't a Tier 5 version, it was just a Tier 1 starship, which Cryptic then kind of hid from being able to be purchased by players whenever they removed the Tier 1 to Tier 4 starships a little while ago. Anyway, the Fleet Tier 6 Oberth is a standard science vessel. There's nothing special about this subclass. It's the standard subclass of science vessels. So 6 weapons, the standard Smasher package, which isn't great, but most of the science vessel Smasher packages are basically the exact same. Almost all of them have this exact same one. I hope Cryptic changes that eventually in the future because it'd be more exciting. But all science vessels get a secondary deflector, which is where a lot of your damage comes from. So if you're choosing a science vessel and not building around your secondary deflector, then you're probably playing it wrong. Just gonna throw it out there. When it comes down to them, they normally don't have access to dual cannons. I know the Not Cool Science Vessel does have access to dual cannons, and there's probably a couple of other ones that do as well that are technically science vessels. But generally speaking, they're okay on stats, and there's nothing particularly special about them. That's kind of what it comes down to them. When it comes to the Grissom, here's the new skin for it. This is the base stats of if you're flying the C-Store variant. Keep in mind the Fleet variant will typically have an extra 10% hull and shields. Today's version of the Fleet version of the Oberth actually doesn't have 10% higher shields. It's listed 1.4 for its C-Store and 1.52 for its Fleet version. It actually should be 1.54 if we're actually doing the normal 10% increase for its shields. I don't know if that's a typo or if they're just like, nah, that's 1.54 would be way too powerful for the Oberth, a starship that's known for being blown up in one shot, which I don't blame Cryptic for. I mean, when I did my proposal for what a Tier 6 Oberth would look like, it was complete science seating with all science consoles and no engineering, no tactical whatsoever. But I guess Cryptic felt that would have been too underpowered / overpowered, and so they just went with this route, which is definitely the more safe route, I guess, if we want to put it that way. What you have access to is just Commander Science Temporal, which is nice. Temporal is one of the best to have for Commander, if not the best. It is an extremely versatile Commander specialization. There's a lot of the Temporal abilities that are actually decent. Some of them are a little bit better than the others, but with the stacking aspects of entropy, it's not bad to stack other temporal abilities on top of one another to enhance other abilities. So there's a lot of great things to go on with temporal abilities in general. What is surprising to me is that it is Lieutenant Commander Engineering and Lieutenant Tactical. All of this, and when you add Tier 6S, this is stacking up to look like a decent exotic-based tank, to be honest. And I wasn't expecting that from the Oberth. I was expecting it to be this flimsy little ship with really low stats, but to have the potential to have a lot of damage. And that's not exactly what Cryptic is giving us, which is interesting. It's really interesting to me. When we actually get into comparing versus other ships, again, I'm surprised the Oberth is actually really high in terms of its stats, because if you look at the Fleet Olympic, which is a tier 1 military starship, by the way, it's basically the same stats as the Oberth, but it's 1 less science ability, lower shields, and basically the same stats otherwise. So generally speaking, this Oberth is now going to start outclassing a lot of your older tier 5 science vessels inside the game, which means Cryptic should start updating the other ships too. And I don't know. I don't know how much demand there is for the other science vessels. Science vessels in general don't have a ton of demand in the game versus other things, because Cryptic doesn't promote them as much and explain the mechanics as well for them. It is what it is. The Olympic definitely deserves a tier 6 at some point to be a commander science miracle worker or science command with a commander engineering, because it's a hospital. So I think it'd be cooler to have more of that type of stuff inside the game. Fleet Nova for a tier 6, I think it'd be cool if it was if they just made a scout ship. That one would be very simple and keep it the same stats. But when we talk about other ships, again, here's a Dyson Science Destroyer. Again, in many ways, it's lackluster versus the Oberth, but then again, it's got more tactical abilities, so you can work around that. But you know, we recently got a tier 6 Titan, which was basically the Dyson Science Destroyers but better stats. So generally speaking, a lot of these older ships are being overshadowed by new tier 6 stuff. And with a new trait from the Clarke, the Fleet Titan, or Fleet Comet / Luna, is even better at tanking than it was before. And we will get to that later on in the video. I'm going to apologize for saying this a bunch, but the Clarke trait is really, really strong for tanking. It's hard to use because it takes a specific style of starship to pull it off, but it is very, very strong whenever you're on the right starship. So we will get to that later. I know a lot of you probably saw the Oberth and like me thought, oh, with the bridge officer seating, this is just, you know, at least when it comes to fleet starships for earnable free-to-play players, this is just the Fleet Nautilus, but it is more engineering focused. Now, on the offset, I originally thought, oh, the Oberth has more science abilities than the Nautilus. Well, that's not entirely true, because even though it has 8 science abilities and it only has 7, there is this extra Lieutenant Engineering Temporal. So if you're counting temporal in terms of extra sciencey wizard types of things in space, the Nautilus honestly is pretty comparable, because it's really 8 plus that Ensign Science, which you'll probably use for emergency power to auxiliary. So in functional abilities, it's actually the same potential between these two things. And so if you prefer tactical over engineering, for those of you that are like DPS players, you're probably still going to prefer the Fleet Nautilus over the Fleet Oberth. Just pointing that out to everyone. I still think the Oberth looks better, and it definitely looks better than the Eternal, which was, you know, the staple from the C-Store for a very, very long time. In terms of when people would ask, like, hey, I'm going into science, and what ship should I be picking? A lot of people would say, hey, the Eternal is a very strong starship. It doesn't have a fleet variant, which means it's got its full stats right from the get-go from the C-Store. All you need to do is add a tier 6X token and you're good to go. And its bridge after sitting, whenever you make the universals from the Oberth and the Eternal Science, it's practically the exact same ship in terms of bridge officer seating. The difference being that the Lieutenant Tactical of the Oberth is a tactical temporal on the Eternal. So if you don't like tactical abilities on the Eternal, you can make them temporal, and then all you have is technically 2 wasted abilities in the Lieutenant Engineering and Lieutenant Commander and Engineering abilities. Oh, and the Eternal also has a hangar bay. So in my TLDW, I basically say that the Oberth is just the Eternal, but it's a free-to-play earnable option. That it's just a smidge weaker, And it doesn't have the hanger bay that the Eternal does. The Eternal is a great vessel, and so the Oberth is still going to be a great vessel for you all if you're looking at something new or you want more nostalgia feels, you know, from stuff in the motion picture Wrath of Khan era in Star Trek Online, instead of something from the 31st century. Now, again, as I've mentioned, the Clarke trait for tanking is going to be pretty impactful to the scene, or at least it should be impactful to the scene if people are paying attention to it. For the Clarke trait, you're able to use immerse powered aux or command abilities to basically make it go off. And so here are starships that are able to use command abilities, and they have a hanger bay to enhance those effects that are going to be going off from the Clarke trait. So when I was thinking about it, these were the two ships that came to mind: the Paradox Temple Dreadnought, because it's got Lieutenant Command, and then the Herc Multiple Mission Science Vessel for the Lieutenant Commander Command. Keep in mind, the Paradox is harder to use than the Herc. It's just the way that the scene worked, that it's just a bit harder to use. Funny enough, in this one, I actually would probably make this Lieutenant Commander Universal engineering, funny enough, because I would want to have Reversal Polarity and Aux to Sif in my build, but that's just me speak. They're both great ships, and the Paradox 3 Muds Market is technically account unlockable, although it's pretty expensive to get that account unlock 3 Muds Market bundle. You have to wait for a sale for that. If you have allies that are willing to send hanger pets to surround you, so your Clarke trait is easier to be effective, the Legendary Glen and the Voth Bastille are actually solid options now. I actually didn't like the Glen initially when it came from a tanking perspective, because I was like, you know, I prefer to have at least 3 whole heals alongside a Reversal Polarity in my builds. The only exceptions was I was on exotic builds if I was able to use Aux to Sif, and I couldn't do that on the Glen. So I was like, and this thing really sucks. Now with the Clarke's thing going on, I'm actually okay going down to 2 whole heals, because of how effective that the Clarke's trait, at least as listed, should be. Legendary Glen is account unlock starship. The Voth Bastille is only a single character, but again, with the Clarke trait, you only need 2 command abilities and Aux to Sif if you are doing an exotic tank instead of a weapon-based tank. And going that route, the Voth Bastille has pretty much the best layout, frankly, when it comes to that inside of when it comes to that flexibility in general. So it is really, really nice. Unfortunately, it's a single character right now, so it's not going to be for everyone for sure. It's also really, really small. I mean, I actually have one on my second account that I barely use anymore. Her main ship is the Voth Bastille, and she has the full Voth 3-piece. So to have that Voth battle cloak, which is kind of pointless, but it's fun to use nonetheless. Of course, there's also the Sona Command Science Vessel. Again, this is one of my favorite science vessels in the game, and with the Commander Science Command is able to use the Clarke trait just fine. We also have the Perma Voyager Command Science Vessel, which, you know, got battle cloak, and it's a Federation ship. It's got its own unique animation. Commander Science Command means you're going to do a lot of the same things that the Sona ship could do as well. From a DPS standpoint, it should be a bit of an increase versus the Sona, for how a lot of DPS players like to do their loadouts for their ships. And it's a little bit faster too. So it's really up to you as whether you think that's worthwhile. The Fleet Oberth is still nice though. Now when it comes to the Spearhead Science Destroyers, even though we have a new Spearhead refit, and I didn't cover this in a video because I've been away for 3 months, the Spearhead refit's fine. With the Clarke trait, if this classic Spearhead had command seating, I would actually prefer it over the Science Spearhead refit. Unfortunately, because the Clarke trait exists now, yeah, as a tank, I prefer the Science Spearhead refit. Slightly sad for me to say at this point, but yeah, the refit is definitely nice. You get an extra console. I know people are ragging at it because it's not the legendary crossfield here that has Commander Temporal. And there's, I guess, a little bit of controversy because there are some people who thought that the ship was super good, other people thought it was super terrible because it's like, come on, we really wanted another Commander of Science Temporal. It's like, look, it's fine. It is totally fine. And whenever you have lots of different variants of the same ship, it's okay for each one of them to be its own unique thing. And this one does a very different feel. This one's very much a weapons-based science platform instead of a torpedo or pure exotic only platform. And I think that's totally fine. Each ship should feel different. And I think that Cryptic did that pretty well. As we go into cruisers, and I'm actually not going to cover everything in terms of some of the comparisons for this new cruiser subtype, because it's going to be for its kind of its own video in a little bit whenever the new Rising cruiser comes out, because I am almost willing to bet that the reason why they made the new multi-mission cruiser was because they were trying to figure out a way to make the Rising cruiser more enticing for players to earn. For those of you that don't know, it's basically an open secret at this point. The Rising cruiser is going to be the summer event ship this year, and Cryptic was, and if you're doing patterns for the Tier 5, that it would be basically just a standard cruiser. Well, versus other ships that we've been getting recently, and of course about the buff of flight deck cruisers to flight deck carriers, a standard cruiser without access to dual cannons, no hangar or anything like that, just seems really boring nowadays. I mean, the best thing you've got in terms of if you don't want a hangar base is to go battle cruiser. Because we have the Miracle Worker battle cruisers from the fleet as well, and those ones perform really well and they're very popular. And so Cryptic was looking at the standard cruiser and like, how can we make a new subtype that doesn't tread up exactly upon what dreadnought cruisers currently do, or what flight deck carriers currently do, or battle cruisers, and still fill that void. I personally wish that they went full on and did a subclass that I called a battleship, which would have basically been a juggernaut subtype, but the engineering variant, the cruiser variant anyway. That would have been commander engineering instead of commander tactics. But they decided to do the other route of doing just filling that one hangar void instead, for in my opinion, the Rising cruiser aspect. So that's more appealing. So what they did is they got rid of strategic maneuvering and command track fire to give the ship a hangar bay and dual cannons in terms of access. And it's supposed to be a smidget less durability versus a dreadnought cruiser, but it's supposed to still have a hangar bay and the same mastery package as regular cruisers, which, if you're a DPS captain, it's not very interesting, to be honest. You don't have any crit chance or crit severity in your mastery package. So yeah, DPS captains are still going to prefer dreadnought cruisers over this subtype. Maybe Cryptic will eventually, get interesting in terms of what they offer in terms of these in the future. But for right now, I'm not too impressed. And I haven't changed the stats of these here from the regular cruiser one because we only have one cruiser. It would be kind of pointless for me to make that for this subtype at the moment. When we get 2 to 3, we'll make I will adjust that from there. And I'll also eventually do the Starship classes explain part 3 video, version 3 anyway. So this is the C-Store Clarke. And the reason why they're putting this in this particular bundle is they basically wanted to make a tier 6 Malachowski. I definitely said that wrong. It's basically the starter ship for the Discovery faction inside the game. And they wanted to make a tier 6 version of it, but they're like, how can we justify doing that? They're like, well, if we mess with the model, we can maybe configure it so that it'll work with the Miranda parts. And so we basically say, this is the Malachowski, but it works with the Miranda parts. So that's what they basically did. So this is basically a second tier 6 Miranda that is also available from the fleet too. And so yeah, they're able to do this. And so I mean, if they knew people would pay for it, they would have probably just made a legendary Miranda and had a new Malachowski looking skin for it instead. But they realized that the Miranda doesn't have enough appeal to pull that off, and so they didn't do that. The stats on this thing are still pretty great, honestly. Full commander seating for a ship with this maneuverability is not bad, especially whenever you consider other stuff that's available from the fleet. And then obviously with Tier 6X, you get an extra universal console alongside with what's going on here. So overall, it's not too bad. Whenever you compare it versus the old Tier 6 Fleet Reliant, also just the Fleet Miranda, if you really want to call it that, slightly more durable, slightly less maneuverable. And the old Miranda Tier 6 had 4 tactical consoles. This one only has 3 base. 4, I guess, if you include universal. Well, this one is 5 when you include the universal from Tier 6X. The old Miranda does not have access to the cruiser command, or it doesn't have access to dual cannons, while the new one does. So there is definitely some goods and bads of both. Keep in mind, because both of these are normally meant to be very much weapons based, you're probably going to make this Lieutenant Commander Universal tactical in either case. Because this ship is Commander Command, you could easily make this a torpedo boat. However, if you're wanting to make this a tank platform, keep in mind the ship does not have access to command and track fire. So it is a slight downside to using a multi-mission cruiser. Keep in mind though, in order for command and track fire to work to decrease threat of your allies, the allies have to be within your cruiser aura, which, let's be realistic, this is Star Trek Online, and a lot of people play TFOs even on elite difficulty and aren't very coordinated. So even when I've tanked, I guess it was a couple, well, yeah, I guess it's still about 3 months ago, because I'm still just barely getting back into the scene. Even back then, most people weren't very coordinated and wouldn't stay my track fire aura anyway, so I just switched to one of the other ones. So at least with these cruiser commands, what it basically is that it's like, you know, if you knew that people weren't going to use track fire anyway, it's like, okay, I want the one that decreases my power costs of my weapons, or am I going to use the one that just allows my shield to be a little slightly more durable and regen a little bit faster? It's kind of what it comes down to. Really, the big advantage of this versus the old Reliant is that the ship has a hangar bay. So for me, this is a smidget improvement over the Reliant, the old Tier 6 Miranda, just because of that hangar bay. If it was just different cruiser commands and access to dual cannons, I would have said that it would still be a wash. I've also included the Legendary Constitution from the 10th anniversary bundle here, just because for the vast majority of players, this is the most realistic way that you would ever get a Tier 6 Constitution. Also a 4.4. The promo pack version is 5.3, but the easily account unlockable version is 4.4. But who knows? They could easily add a TOS Muds Market bundle and put the Temporal Light Cruiser in there as well. I wouldn't put it past Cryptic at this point to do that within the next year or so. In fact, probably within the next year or so, they're probably going to put the Atlas in there. I'm just going to call it right now. They're going to put the Atlas in a Muds Market bundle within the next 12 months. Especially with the economy going the way it is in the next like 4 or 5 months. It's probably going to happen within the next 12. When it comes to the Clarke's trait, which is Clarke's the C2 version of the Malachowski, obviously the flagships are going to be still premier platforms for tanking. They got great command seating to pull off really well. My version of the Legendary Odyssey tank would have to be adjusted a smidget to accommodate the Clarke's trait. My Shemshire operations tank really wouldn't at all. So if you're curious about my tanking in Tier 6 era video in terms of builds for using the Clarke trait, my Scimitar wouldn't have to be adjusted. My Odyssey would a little bit. So just throwing that out there. Both great platforms, both can use the flagship set for tanking. Both still solid options regardless for tanking or for torpedo builds. I am listing the Legendary Ambassador here just because After I made my 11th anniversary video, they did change that particular ship from Temporal Command to Intel Temporal, because there are some people, me included, that were saying that, hey, if it's Temporal Command, it's not really fulfilling the whole purpose unless you're clearly saying, hey, we want a 4.4 version of the Temporal Light Cruiser effectively available to players, like in this bundle. And that's basically what it was before. They changed it to make it be something different. Of course, we have the promo Constitution from promo boxes. It is there. Temporal Command is still really nice for the Clarke trait. As for these two flight deck carriers, I am going to mention as well, prior to the Clarke trait, I viewed these two tanking platforms anyway, as basically the same. Now they're both very solid for DPS as well, don't get me wrong on that, but at least from tanking, the only real difference between these two ships was one of them used Ox to Bat for its cooldowns. That was the promo version, and the legendary version used Photonic Officer for its cooldown management. And depending upon what you're doing, you might want one over the other. And Commander Temporal Operative means that with your molecular reconstruction, you can do defensive and get a lot of extra stuff for you. And that a lot is, at least for me, it's about the worth of a universal console for survival. Now granted, if you're going for offensive potential, Miracle Worker is the best one for that. But from a tanky perspective, these are about the same, which is why when I made that 10th anniversary video, I said I was really surprised that this ship was released as strong as it was, because it is a very strong ship and very underrated in the Star Trek Online community. Cool. All right. Going on to the next thing. If you're going to maximize the Clarke trait, the Fleet Coj and the Fleet Cardenas are your go-to options. They have really high hull, really high shields for a cruiser. And that trait gives you a ton of extra regeneration based upon your maximum hull and maximum shields. It's not even based upon your ratio, but just your maximum. But the base ratio does give you higher amounts that your other stuff is stacking to get that higher amount of maximum hull, max shield for your regeneration. Just like the Malachowski, the Fleet Coj only has, and Fleet Cardenas only have 3 base tactical consoles. So that is something to keep in mind. These are from Fleet Tier 1 military, while these are from Fleet Tier 2 military. And right now, Cruiser Commands versus Multi-Mission Cruiser Command. Very solid ship regardless. No Lieutenant Commander Tactical, so slight disadvantage in that aspect, but in the grand scheme of things, especially with the Clarke trait now inside the game, it's going to be a very solid starship. You can almost just use the Clarke trait plus history we're going to remember, and you can almost put everything else in offense pretty much on the ship and be just fine. All right. Of course, when it comes to fleet starships, I can't conclude without mentioning these two bad boys. The Fleet Miracle Worker battlecruisers and the Fleet Flight Deck Assault Carriers are ridiculously good for the vast majority of players. If you want full weapons-based damage, regular energy-based weapons-based damage, the Fleet Miracle Worker battlecruisers are, in my recommendation, the go-to ships to use. If you're doing torpedo builds or tanking builds, or you just want to have fun with hangars and hangar pets, the Flight Deck Assault Carriers are your go-to. So hangar base, really nice ratios that are higher than, with the durability and maneuverability, it's higher than a lot of your cruisers inside the game, frankly, at least from the fleet. Tank Commander Command means it's a decent torp boat, and with its setup, it's not a bad tank either. So keep in mind as well, for the Flight Deck Assault Carriers in particular, the Federation and Klingon versions do not have cloaks, but they do have a smidget higher hull. So if you're deciding between those or the Suitable Silic, ask yourself, am I realistically going to use the Battle Cloak? If it's a yes, use the Suitable Silic. If not, statistically speaking, you should be going for the Federation or KDF version. I love having the option of cloaks, so I prefer the Suitable Silic person. But I recognize, especially on console, that I think just recently got a fix on their cloaking bug. A lot of you may not be that experienced with using cloaks and might just prefer to have regular ships instead. That is perfectly fine. All right, so for this next section, we're going to traits, consoles, and the bundle stuff. The bundle exclusive stuff, by the way, is just more of cosmetic stuff. So if you don't care about that, then you don't have to worry about the bundle extra stuff. First off, I'll talk about the trait for the Oberth first. The trait is called By the Book. And with this trait, your bridge officer anomalies extend the duration of all active bridge officer anomalies, including the ones you just activated, by an extra 2 seconds. And so the way that I see this is that it's basically improved gravity well, but it extends the duration of all of your active anomalies instead of just gravity well. For the slight downside that you don't have any damage resistance debuff applying it inside that AoE, which means versus improved gravity well, it's going to depend upon map in terms of which one's going to be better. And I'll just say this right now. In a coordinated pre-made team, if you're playing IC and HSC, I can almost guarantee if you're choosing one or the other, in IC and HSC, improved gravity well is going to give you more damage, because enemies are just not going to last long enough for that extra duration to matter, which means that damage resistance debuff from improved gravity well is going to matter, and the extra duration isn't, so it's just by default going to win. If you're playing practically any other space map, I think By the Book is just going to be a better option for you. And for most circumstances, I would say By the Book is basically going to replace improved gravity well for most recommended exotic based builds inside the game, because there is a cap in terms of how much different abilities can be extended. I think it's either half or like equal to the amount that the regular duration was, and so this doesn't stack with how long gravity well can actually be with improved gravity well. So you're basically going to be choosing one or the other. I've listed there below what the blog said was the different various AoEs that can proc this and be affected by this. The blue ones are ones that are just ones that are available to just science abilities in general. The yellowish ones are ones from temporal specialization seats, and the ionic turbulence is one for intel seats. Oh, sorry. I a little bit ahead of myself. The console is called Phase Space Membrane. I know a lot of people are looking at this console and they're going goo goo gaga over the potential to have 400% bonus damage for their torpedoes for 1 second. I understand that can be really powerful. Most people won't be able to do that. The reason why they added the extreme costs and cons to this console was specifically because they did not want to make a DPRM 2.0. They specifically wanted this console to be powerful, but they wanted you to have to work around its faults to make sure that that power is in check. Instead of just stacking a bunch of really strong, damaging consoles, this is one that's very powerful, but you have to build around it. You have to think about it. The cost is that you're losing 20 auxiliary power per second that it's active. Your power transfer rate is capped at 250%. And the clicky of this automatically stops if your auxiliary power drops to 0, which makes sense. The pros, the biggest one is that you have a stacking each second. You're getting an extra 20% bonus to torpedo weapons, which is insane for damage, which is great. The thing that I care about as a tank captain, you have complete immunity to physical and kinetic damage. So let's say, for instance, you're about to get bombarded by a bunch of Invisitorps or a barrage of weapons from like the Vaudois or something like that. You click this thing and, oh hey, they just hit me. They did 0 damage, even though normally it one-shots my Starship. It is a complete counter to those attacks. Granted, it's a 2-minute recharge with only up to 20 seconds maximum force duration. That's the way that I see it. It is I could easily die from this barrage of weapons, like as a tank captain. I'm going to use this clicky to make sure that I survive through it. And so if you're doing a Cytorp tank, you can honestly use this console probably in place of the DPRM. And this will still work for on an exotic build, at least, even if you don't build around having extra aux power, you only have, you know, that 120, 125, this is still probably going to last 7 to 8 seconds. So 7 to 8 seconds of immunity to physical and kinetic damage is a really big deal. And think about it this way: in ISC and HSC, the big things that typically kill me as a tank captain is generally the spike damage from physical and kinetic sources, mines, torpedoes, and the like. That's why we have consoles like Perimeter Field Projector, DPRM, stuff like that, and like traits like Invincible, is to make sure that if we should have gone one-shotted, we now survive through it. And so for me, even 7 to 8 seconds of that being up for a side torp tank is completely worth it for me as a clicky console, ignoring everything else on this. Now, yes, if you're using a duty officer that's like setting all of your power levels to maximum for a few seconds and extending this farther, that would be nice for sure, especially on a side torp build where your main damage is exotic abilities, but you have torpedoes alongside them too. So that would be nice, but that immunity to physical kinetic damage, even for 6, 7, 8 seconds, is still worthwhile to me for those really, really tough maps. It's not going to be a console for every map for a tank, but it's still a really, really powerful console. And yes, for pure torpedo builds that are exotic based and you're having auxiliary as your primary, I guess probably just watch a video from Augie, and he'll probably show you how to build your ship to make this really, really good. And who knows, if his stuff is super good, then maybe I'll do a video saying how I've adapted stuff from what he has experimented with, and how to do maybe some example tanking stuff with what he's discovered. We'll see. I've been away for 3 months, and so maybe there's something from that 32nd century discovery lockbox that I'm not thinking about that might be really, really good, that makes this even easier to get to that 400% bonus all damage for torpedo weapons. I still need to look back at this stuff in that lock. So we'll see how things go as I get back into things. In terms of the Clarke trait, again, the trait is called greater than the sum. This thing is ridiculously good. So what's going on with this trait, and why am I so excited about it? So the description says, whenever you use emergence power to auxiliary, or you use command abilities, it grants extra hull and shield regeneration and subsystem power to self and to nearby allies. This nearby allies is within 5 kilometers, which is not very much. A lot of your serious auras that actually are really meant to buff your team are 10 to 20 kilometers. Just as an FYI. So this 5 kilometers basically means they're saying, if you want this trait to be good, make sure you have hangar pets or have allies send you their hangar pets whenever they launch them, so that you are able to get this buff around you. So the buff is basically, whenever you activate Merge Paradox or command abilities, you get 2 to 20 power and 0.3 to 3% max HP and max shields every single second. And this is for 10 seconds. And this range of 2 to 20 power or 0.3 to 3% max HP and max shields, that's based upon how many allies are buffed. So, and doing the math, pretty simple to do that. You have the potential with this trait to have an extra 180% hull regeneration and an extra 180% shield regeneration if you happen to keep this up and have this at max stacks the whole time. This is good for hull regeneration. Don't get me wrong, this is great for hull regen. This is ridiculously strong for shield regeneration. We've had so few traits in consoles that actually help shield regeneration inside of this game. Like, the last one I could think of that was actually seriously decent was the Alliance Battlecruisers console. And the reason why this is so good, by the way, is because when I talked about tanking in my video 6 months ago called Tanking in the Tier 6X Era video, which was several hours long. So yes, I've talked a lot about this, even just single videos. I basically said in that video, pretty much don't stack maximum shields, because there's really no way in the game right now, besides one trait really, that maximum shield is going to help your survival really, because it gets bursted down and you can't get it back up. That's why Darkblade mentioned a few times, it's like, it doesn't matter if you stack a ton of hull and stack a ton of shields. Those high amounts only matter if you can keep your amount of hull and shields up there. If it's like you have a ton of that max and it goes down to like nothing for most of the combat, then what was the point of stacking that much? With this trait greater than the sum, it's now a legitimate option for you to stack maximum shields, which is an extreme boon to the tanking community. It's an extreme boon. I hope more people talk about this. Now, I also hope that Cryptic doesn't just nerf this trait to the ground, because I think it's awesome and it could help in making shield tanking not just viable, but really, 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 really good. I mean, whenever we see this Star Trek shows, besides starships that are called Voyager or Discovery, pretty much whenever your shields go down, you're basically toast. And you have to do negotiations, or you have to flee, or your ship gets blown up. That's pretty much how it works in Star Trek. In Star Trek Online, that's not how it works. Instead, it's like, oh, your shields are down. Well, that doesn't matter. You have decent hull, then you'll still be okay. It doesn't matter. It would be cool if, from an RP perspective, that we could actually build starships in this game. That it's, hey, my shields stay up. That is how I survive. And if my shields go down, then I go away, and have it actually be decent, like pretty good builds for tanking. Now, yes, my exotic tanks still rely a lot upon their shields, even prior to this, but they still had to have a decent amount of hull and a decent amount of things for hull heals. That's why even in most of my tank stuff, even on my exotic tanks, I still want 2 or 3 hull heals in my build, because, for instance, shields still have 5 to 10% bleed through, and there are a lot of damage in this game that completely bypasses shields. And so, if Cryptic is going to want shield tanking to be viable, which I think they should, because it's something that's in the TV shows, these are my 2 things that I personally feel has to happen in the game for shield tanking to be viable. First off, there needs to be a way to get perfect shields more easily. And perfect shields, by the way, is shields that do not have bleed through. Normally, shields, by the way, have 5 to 10% bleed through, meaning if you have, let's just do simple math here. If you have something that hits your shields for 100 damage, well, your shields will absorb 90 to 95 of that damage, depending upon the type of shield. Most shields, it's 90. Some of the more common ones are 95%. That's just 95 damage, and then 5 to 10 of that. Then the remaining damage, whether it's 5 or 10, will go through your shields and hit your hull, which is not great. You know, if you know you're getting hit by milling crits, you know, it'd be nice if you know your shields could absorb most, if not all of that, so your hull doesn't need to. Not having bleed through would be pretty nice. The remaining defense screen is good because it actually gives you perfect shields. So one of the only sources that I could think of off the top of my head. There probably are a few other ones as well, and people will probably yell at me for not remembering them in the comments too. The second point, we need a way, at least from a survival perspective for tanking, to redirect damage that bypass shields, whether it's through bleed through or through just damage that inherently bypasses shields, or bonus damage on top of damage that bypasses shields. There are a couple things that do that in Star Trek Online. There needs a way to redirect that damage back to your shields. If Cryptic is able to do these 2 things, it could even be 2 different starship traits, and it would still be good enough. If Cryptic adds those things alongside what they've already done, shield tanking becomes a viable, legitimate way to tank inside this game, and you can ignore hull and it's fine. I hope that we get to that point in this game, that becomes a reality. I don't know if we will get there, but I hope that at some point that we do. All right, with that rant over, let's actually get into the Genesis bundle. The Again, the extra goodies in the Genesis bundle outside the 2 ships are completely cosmetic. You don't have to worry about it if you don't like cosmetic stuff. So I understand that some of you might just wait for sales, or if you have like 50% off coupons from like Ecomoss purchases and stuff like that, you might just get the 2 ships and call it a day. If you get the Genesis bundle, there's going to be 2 upgrade tokens to tier 6X, and you're going to get 2 fleet modules as well. So typically with C-Star Starships is that if a C-Star Starship has a fleet variants normally are 5 fleet modules, unless you have its corresponding C-Star Starship. In that case, the cost is reduced from 5 fleet modules to 1. So with 2 fleet modules in this bundle space, is saying, hey, if you're wanting to get these ships to tier 6X and have a fleet version that's tier 6X, you're able to do that fairly easily with what's in the bigger Genesis bundle. I don't think it's quite as worthwhile because most people only fight just a couple of ships and they buy newer ships for the most part, get better traits and consoles to make their main favorite ships better. But it's your own cup of tea and your money. For the actual ground stuff itself, the ground device is called the Genesis device. It's basically the Foundry version, but it doesn't have this coffin. So it's going to have that animation. If you want to look up this Foundry sunset thing, and look at this little GIF, you'll see it activating and then blows up into a bunch of fun green stuff and a coffin. This version doesn't have the coffin. Only the Foundry authors that were featured get the one with the coffin. As for something else, there's also the Type 2 phaser pistol. This is already an earnable item inside the game. It's from the Davidian arc called Night of the Comet. This is also called the Spectres arc because the first mission is called Spectres. This is a harder arc to find nowadays because Cryptic decided to hide most of the arcs and missions from the game that were older and out of date. But there was 3 arcs in particular that were still too important to the story to completely remove from the game. The Davidian arc, the Lost Dominion 2800 arc. There was another one they removed. Oh, the one on Nimbus. The group of missions on Nimbus were also removed from the neural mission bureau, besides for Romulan captains, because they're not fully voice acted. And there's a lot of other miscellaneous missions that they've also removed because of lack of voice acting, and that's also why they redid a lot of the Romulan missions as well, because they wanted them voice acted. And so a lot of the revamping, like a year or 2 ago, was the voice acting aspect. They added a couple of cutscenes, but it was mostly to implement voice acting, so they could say, hey, you know, here's Star Trek Online, everything's voice acted. Because in the early days, Star Trek Online was not voice acted. In the early days, it was just a couple of things here and there, and that was it. Most of those voice acting in the early days was Cryptic employees playing players, or playing characters anyway, in the game. Erland, Sarah Minans, and people like that. So Star Trek Online has definitely changed gears in that, and so it's gotten more expensive. They've charged more things because of that. Also, the economy's inflated too. The biggest thing with this bundle, in terms of why you might want to get it, is because there are account unlocked Lobi uniforms in it. There is the Wrath of Khan Engineers Vest, Wrath of Khan Captain's Vest, and the Wrath of Khan Excursion Jacket. Those are 3 Lobi uniforms that normally cost 200 Lobi each. And they would now be account unlocked. I do not know if non-Federation captains can access these uniforms. I will not be able to tell you that. And from Cryptic's track record, I would not be able to tell you that. Because, I mean, there have been things before. Like, for instance, there have been Hollow Bridge officers that formerly were Federation only, and when they released them in Mud's Market, they became available to everyone. And there have been other uniforms that's been the same way. So I can't tell you if these Lobi uniforms will be available to the KDF and the Romulan Republic. They might be, they might not. Also, let's keep in mind the Wrath of Khan movie uniform, the classic one that you have a lot of your officers have essentially. This is already available from the Zen store. I mean, you don't have to actually buy this bundle to get it. And in fact, this is not even included in this Genesis bundle. I guess kind of nice, because otherwise it would have probably inflated the price even more. But I think overall, I think it's fine. If you're wanting this thing just because you wanted the Wrath of Khan Classic look, you don't have to buy this bundle to get that. It's already available inside the C-Store. So just as an FYI for you all. Also, this Excursions jacket, there is a similar version available from one of the Discovery era missions inside of Star Trek Online. It's like the one, it's like the ground snowy mission where you're with Lorca and Landry and such. And then there's a lot of people who die during that mission, because people die in Discovery a lot. Anyway, there's a different jacket that you can earn in that is available to everyone for sure. If you're really keen on these and want these accounts unlocked, this is a way to do it. There are alternative or cheaper options to do that instead of having to get the Genesis bundle. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so for TLDR, we have a new bundle called the Genesis bundle, and we are getting 2 starships with it, along with some extra goodies. The bundle is priced at 7,500 Zen, with 4,875 Zen being the price on initial sale. Keep in mind, these are C-Store starships, and they are 2 different starships. I do know that a couple of people on Reddit were mentioning, like, hey, you know, a lot of your 2 starship bundles are typically like 5,000 to 6,000 Zen. Well, that's the case because typically your older 5,000 to 6,000 Zen 2 starship bundles were because it was a Federation and Klingon starship that were basically the exact same starship. And so it's not completely fair to compare those starships to these ones, because these ones are actually 2 different starships that perform 2 different roles. That being said, you know, there is still character art to consider between 2 starships and 2 starships for different bundles. So it's like comparing apples to oranges. You know, you have 2 apples and 2 oranges. Yes, they both cost more when you get more of each, but there's not an exact one-on-one comparison for all of that. Besides, you know, if you really want to go for specific things like calories and stuff, you know, fine. There's ways to compare them, but it's harder to fairly compare the 2. For these C-Store starships, by the way, they can be purchased outside of the Genesis bundle. So if you're waiting for a sale or something for starships, you can always just wait for those sales, whether it's during this or something else. I don't know what sales will be around during this besides this 35% off for the Genesis bundle itself. As for the 2 starships, we have a Tier 6 Oberth, finally. It has a new skin called Grissom, and it looks okay. The Oberth pretty much now is an earnable, slightly weaker fleet version of the 31st Century Eternal that is in the C-Store. And when it comes down to it, it's a slightly weaker because it's it doesn't have 2 special seats. It only has Commander Temporal, but still Commander Temporal is still really nice. And it doesn't have a hangar bay. Outside of those 2 things, it's very comparable to the 31st Century Eternal that is purchasable in the C-Store. So for free-to-play players that were looking for an Eternal from the fleet, the Oberth is your go-to option now. As for the other ship, which is a cruiser, it is a Tier 6 version of the Malachowski, which is the Discovery starter ship, Discovery era starter ship for Discovery Free Federation captains. They put it in this bundle, and they did some magic so that you could also use the Miranda looks and skins on this Tier 6 starship as well. And that's how they're able to fit it into this Wrath of Khan motion picture era of starships. So you can kit bash those different things together on it, and it's basically just a Tier 6 Miranda with full command specialization and access to dual cannons, because they made a new cruiser subclass just so that they could basically make a cruiser that had access to dual cannons without breaking their own conventions. For the traits to consoles from the C-Star versions of those new starships, the Clarke trait is a very, very strong tanking trait, especially when it comes to shield regeneration. Unfortunately, the Clarke trait requires command abilities for it to basically work really well. So it's not going to be, even though it should be a really strong tanking trait, there's a ton of ships that it cannot be used on. So there is that to consider. The Clarke console is just going to be an exotic AoE console. Keep in mind, it is not a targeted AoE console, which means you're gonna probably have to position it like how you use the mycelial space 4-piece. Now it's that 4-piece is a really strong clicky ability, but you have to aim it. I'm guessing the Clarke console is going to be the same way. Whether it's actually really strong, that's up to whether Cryptic decides it's going to be strong or not. The Oberth trait is basically a bridge officer AoE extender. For all of your AoE anomalies, pretty much do exotic damage. You activate one of those, the rest of them that are in the field last 2 seconds longer. There's technically a limit, but it'd probably be pretty hard to hit that limit. Basically, it's improved gravity well, but it's basically for all of your anomalies instead of just gravity well. The Oberth console is the big stand up for the DPS community. You're able to potentially get a ton of extra bonus torpedo damage on its clicky, but because you're losing 20 auxiliary power every single second and the clicky goes away whenever you reach 0 auxiliary power, a lot of players won't be able to get to that maximum bonus damage potential with torpedoes. For me as a tank captain, I am more interested in the Oberth console because you are immune to physical and kinetic damage while the clicky is going. So for me, that's an extremely effective survival console when it comes to ISC and HSC that have a lot of Invisitorps and lots of different things that can easily one-shot you from those particular 2 resistances. So being able to have something like that just says, hey, I don't take damage for a few seconds from that type of damage, and that's the type of damage that normally is the one-shot kills you stuff in Star Trek Online. That's an extreme boon. They had to put the negatives on the console just so that it wouldn't become an instant slot for every tank and every torpedo DPS captain in ISC and HSC. That's why they put those downsides on it. As for the Genesis bundle itself, exclusive to it, there's 2 fleet ship modules and 2 experimental upgrade tokens. If you want those, great. I think we've gotten so many free ship modules and upgrade tokens at this point that it's basically fluff. What is carrying the bundle is the low-buy uniforms, frankly. If you care about those 3 account unlocked low-buy uniforms, then go for it and buy the bundle. That by itself is going to be worth that 7,500 Zen or 5,000 Zen on sale. Those by itself will carry the bundle. Otherwise, it's a tough call to buy the bundle. Just put it that way. The ground vending device, whatever. Type 2 phaser pistol, it's already a mission reward inside the game. And then ship modules and experimental upgrades. It seems like every couple of months, Cryptic has you, hey, do this for a couple of days and you get a free upgrade token. I think it's basically meh at this point for those things. But that's just my opinion. It's totally up to you what y'all wish to do. But anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for being patient with me and me going through my stuff that I've had to deal with over the past couple of months. One important thing to note for you all, my next video on the channel will not be Star Trek Online. I'm going to be doing something long and weird for the Solasta community. There's a game I've been playing a bit. It's called Solasta Crown of the Magister. I'm basically going to be making just one video, just a one and done video. That'll be just going over every single spell in Solasta and my personal opinions of every single one of those spells, as well as what I've found are my favorite compositions. Not necessarily the best ones, but what I feel are my favorite ones especially ones that are very unconventional, especially versus the way people have been ranking different classes. They're unconventional, but work really well synergistically or under certain challenge circumstances on its hardest difficulty inside of that game. So I will be making that. It'll take maybe a week or 2 to make that video. And then after that, I will be getting back to the videos that y'all voted on a couple of months ago when it comes to orders of things for this channel. So basically, very easily mid-July, expect to see regular Star Trek Online content again on this channel. I'm also contemplating doing Twitch for Twitch streaming and such. If I did do that, it would be a bit different. Like, I probably wouldn't use webcam, just not a thing for me. And for me playing Star Trek Online, it wouldn't be traditional playing. I'd probably be alternating between actually playing the game, like going through the missions and having audio basically off on the missions and just talking about things in the missions. Alternating between that and actually going through the actual written lore outside of the game that impacts the game. Like, various comics, various, lore blogs and things, different backgrounds on certain ships, back when Cryptic used to do that, in terms of how that's actually impacted the story, descriptions of loot boxes and certain starships when they were announced and released, in terms of how that affects the lore, or certain starships should be added to different missions because of how those things are actually implied in those backgrounds and that type of stuff. If you think that would be interesting, feel free to comment that below. If you all think that that's just a waste of time and I should just not worry about that, feel free to let me know as well. For those of you that are actually listening to my rants at the end of these videos, y'all are the ones that'll be most passionate and most likely to see those types of things anyway. But anyway, thank you all for watching. Thank you for being patient with me. And yeah, enjoy the next week or so.